Welcome to Stories We Love. Stories We Love is about people who I think are doing good in the world. And one of my favorite things in our government is our Constitution and Bill of Rights. And I have here with me Robert Barnes, who is a constitutional lawyer and he does other kind of law. And so I wanted to learn more and talk more about the Constitution and how valuable it is, because in America it's a big thing, at least to me, and I value our country. So, welcome, Robert. Thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about you, just so people know more? Because that would be good.
Absolutely. So been practicing law for about a quarter century here in the United States, licensed in by the Supreme Court of the United States, Tennessee, Wisconsin, California. But made appearances in courts all across the country on what's called a pro hoc vice basis. A member of many federal appellate and district courts. We do. My firm basically does a lot of constitutional law, criminal, civil law, all kinds. We basically represent a range of people who have unique cases, often cases that have consequence to the broader public beyond the reach of their case, and work with 1776 Law Center, which provides independent support for people who can't always afford access to the courts of law and courts of public opinion. And we work with them to provide that access where and when we can in cases of great constitutional consequence.
Sounds like you guys do a lot. And you're kind of well dispersed over the country. I like that. Um, okay, so what made you decide to become a constitutional lawyer?
Well, the I'd always wanted to, or I guess I thought I always wanted to enter the practice of law in order to influence politics and in policy. And just along the way, the opportunity presented itself to practice law in areas that are often underserved for populations that are often underrepresented. And that's what sort of led me to these. I mean, what normally the common denominator in a lot of my clients' cases, even if the particular client was successful in life in general, was that they were in their case where I was representing them an underdog. So even if it was someone like Robert Kennedy or Wesley Snipes or Ralph Nader or Donald Trump or Alex Jones, in the case in which I represented them, they were an underdog or an outsider going up against institutional power, often trying to weaponize the law against the interest of the constitutional rights and civil liberties of ordinary Americans. And so that just sort of naturally progressed into our practice as it is today.
That's fascinating. When, to me, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is rather sacred. Can you talk about how important both of those documents are?
Well, they're the foundation of American civil society and constitutional governance, and they are really the best and purest expression of the American Revolution, a revolution that birthed an entire new way of governing upon the world, that and established a new basis for governing around the world. In other words, for centuries, we were governed by people who said God had ordained them to rule over us. The divine right of kings, as it was once called. And the American Revolution reversed all of that and said, in fact, the only legitimate government is a government of the people, is a government that originates from our original natural law rights that we are born with, invested with as individual human beings, and that any correct government must represent, reflect, and protect those rights. And otherwise, it wasn't a legitimate government at all. And the best way to protect those rights, those original rights, just for us being human beings, us universally sharing those rights, was a constitution, a sort of sacred contract between the people and those that would be put into positions of power to enforce that constitution, to govern our civil society. So there's no question it was a unique aspect of the American Revolution, arguably its most unique, and also arguably its purest expression of what was one of the most humanitarian revolutions in world history.
That really moves me. Yeah, it's so beautiful that our founding fathers wanted us um, to have our rights. There are many countries that don't have that anymore, or ever, maybe, I don't know. But I got teary. So thank you so much. And where, like when we talk about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, where does it come into play in terms of what certain policies or certain um, presidents or Congress do that, might support it or might not support it? Where do you see these things happening?
It should be the cornerstone, the touchstone, the foundation of every policy decision. Any question about who we give power to should first filter that through the Constitution and the original rights established, recognized, and protected thereby. And then every other aspect and attribute of any governmental policy should be seen through the prism of the Constitution. And if it doesn't, then chances are it will go AWOL. It'll be absent without law in this sense, not just absent without leave of our constitutional liberties and rights, and endanger those liberties and rights and return us to a tyrannical style of government that will be, as Thomas Jefferson once said, as dangerous to our souls as our bodies and our property. And we see that in many different contexts today. It has been a constant struggle for several centuries to fully enforce and fully embrace all of the liberties founded and established by the Constitution. As Abraham Lincoln said at Gettysburg, that the Civil War was about an effort to continue and extend and embrace all of the Constitution for all of its people, to have a government, quote, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And any policy that doesn't protect and enforce and extend those constitutional original principles is abhorrent to the Constitution, and by the very logic of our Declaration of Independence, abhorrent to any civil society and unconscionable under our constitutional system of governance.
We're in trouble. Okay, so with regard to that, are there certain bills or policies that have been established currently? Like, well, let me go back for a second. Do all the people who are in government have to read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and understand it? Is that part of being in government?
The oath that they take is to the Constitution of the United States. And if they're in a state government, also the Constitution of their state government. However, I mean, I was just in a criminal trial in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where the question that I got the most objections to, that I was not even allowed to ask, a judge was actually a witness in that case. The judge was orchestrating the criminal prosecution, as it turned out to be. And my first question to the judge was, is the Constitution a rule of law in his court, a rule of the court? Because it was happened to be a relevant issue in the case. He acted like he didn't know the answer. So I asked him, well, when you took an oath of office, was that oath to the Constitution of the United States? And all of a sudden, the prosecutor screamed objection. The judge, presiding over the case, screamed objection. Wouldn't even allow me to ask whether or not he took an oath to the Constitution of the United States in a criminal case before a jury trial. It gives you an idea of how amiss we have become. Increasingly, even though they take the oath to the Constitution, the real oath they're taking is to the people that put them there, the people that can keep them there, to the institutional press, to the donor class, to their allies in the political and legal world. But none of that will show up in their oath, but it's often the only oath they're really honoring and obeying.
Like I said, we're in trouble. This is just kind of crazy. And how did that case turn out? Did you guys win?
It's yet to be determined because it will be going up on appeal, and it goes to a lot of issues, the right to record a public proceeding in which you are a party or participant. The courts in Pennsylvania are trying to prohibit people from recording their own court proceedings. prohibit people from broadcasting any aspect of a court proceeding. They want to keep a monopoly on the truth of what took place, such that it often doesn't end up being the truth of what took place. It's the anytime you give any agency, any institution, any individual power that's outside of its constitutional anchor or moorings, you will get set adrift. And that's what's happened in Pennsylvania. But it'll be up to the higher courts or the legislative branch, as may necessarily be the case, to step in and finally fix what is a constitutionally abhorrent custom and practice in the courthouses of Pennsylvania.
Yes, I mean, it seems to me in courts that there should be transparency because otherwise people can spin what happened. I think that happened in many cases, especially with government officials. Like, I think they had a closed door with Dr. Fauci, and I don't remember who else, but I just remember thinking, make it open, make it transparent. This is America. It's by the people, for the people, of the people, all that stuff. I think I said it wrong, but I think we need to have transparency. It doesn't make any sense to hide things if you
From
are.
the very from the very beginning of this country, the your typical trial was held outdoors. That you didn't have a courthouse with indoor court, all of that. So that's how public and open and transparent the process was supposed to be. Everybody was supposed to be able to participate. Everybody was supposed to observe. And now you're seeing proceedings in our federal courts. They don't allow any video broadcasting of the trial. Some state courts, like Pennsylvania, are now prohibiting both broadcasting and recording of what's taking place. Only the officially recognized court reporter is allowed to make transcripts. In the case we had, the court reporter was constantly making mistakes in the underlying case that led to my client recording the proceeding because she was able to prove the court reporter is fabricating the record. And but it turned out that's what the courts wanted in that particular case, in the underlying case. And so it really raises serious ethical and professional questions, but more importantly, constitutional questions about how we're governed and who governs us and what to do when they fail to do so consistent to the Constitution.
Wow. I'm glad you're out there. I'm glad other constitutional lawyers are out there too, because this sounds pretty manipulative and pretty corrupt. With regard to, I know you mentioned natural law and those rights that are bestowed upon us by natural law. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, really, the idea of the American Revolution derived from a intellectual tradition that you could connect back to the Enlightenment, that you could connect back much further, which was what gives anybody the right to govern anyone else, what creates the rights of civil society, and when we bind ourselves to one another, what rights do we have to impose upon another and have another impose upon us? And rather than the original power structure of, well, God ordained the person, maybe a pope, maybe a king, maybe both, this new idea was, no, actually, God invested our soul with that capacity because we are representations and reflections of God on earth. And that, there was a great quote that said that, all the corrupt institutions, there are two great schools they can never close, no matter how many books they burn. And that's the archives of nature and the conscience of man. And the idea is that those represented sort of God's forensic fingerprints on the world.
Mm.
And that if we studied the archives of nature and the conscience of man, we would come and we would be able to divine the truth. And that real power, real responsibility arose and originated from our individual human being, our individual human souls as being representative and expressive of God. And consequently, the only legitimate, morally or otherwise, governance would be one in which we consent to be governed, that, the social contract theory, because we are the ones who originate the authority for government's existence in the first instance. And that by doing so, we can come together and form a government that protects and recognizes and respects our individuality and the rights accorded thereto. that we're not sacrificing that to be part of a community, that what we're sacrificing is only those things that would infringe or impinge upon another's freedom or liberty. And that radical revolution is what really precipitated the intellectual and ideological history of the American Revolution, and that's what's most deeply expressed in our Constitution. And the problem is, of course, that you always are stuck with, if you're only going to give power to a small group of people, that small group of people will find a way to misuse and abuse that power. And our Constitution tried to limit that by not giving them that power in the first instance in many cases, and also providing a check through the jury system on that. But you're in a constant battle of politicians and the corrupt class of elites who seize and obtain power, not wanting to abide by the limits on that power.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And what you did say though about natural law and about nature and about the soul, to me, it's so beautiful. It was such a beautiful thought, and it seems like that would be such a winning, um, such a winning intention for a country to be able to see that. And it seems like now, I mean, we have GMO that does not respect nature. We have um, pesticides that don't respect nature. Most people, there are some people I know who do look at nature as teacher, because I see nature as a teacher. But but a lot of people that are kind of in the top 1% of money owners, they seem to not look at what nature does and instead try to innovate something, I think, for the patent so that they can make money. And to me, it just seems like nature is such a good teacher. And if we listen to nature, nature will respond in a way that is abundant and is brilliant, and that we humans are connected to nature, that there's no distance because we are of nature. We breathe in nature, we walk on nature, we live with nature, it's part of us, and that thing about our soul, I mean, to me, that is something that is so key, to have that. So do you have a solution for people who are going into government or who are in government? Like, is there a way that they could take a constitutional law class in order, like, what can we do to make judges and lawyers and um, all the people in Congress and all the presidents and all the people that work in the regulatory agencies, is there a way to get them to, read and learn and study it and have a real understanding and respect for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights?
I mean, that's what originally our educational structure was supposed to be about when it was farmer schools, where, you went to school during the time of season that wasn't harvest season. Was you had basic civics as well as basic literacy and basic math and basic reading, writing, arithmetic, as it was called, was that you would learn the Constitution and our history. That unfortunately is increasingly not done. And instead, our schools of education have become schools of indoctrination, and often indoctrination to ideologies that are illiterate in our constitutional liberties and freedoms and foundation. So there's definitely a revolution of mindset you could help recreate if you restored the original principles of public education and civics. But the other thing I think we've witnessed over time has been that who do we give power to? The best way to protect the Constitution is to give power to the people who have the greatest interest and concern for that Constitution. That will never really be an elite group that like power, because the Constitution is abhorrent to the concentration of power, to the misuse of power. So the very psychology that leads a certain subset of the population to seek and succeed in obtaining power is abhorrent to constitutional principle and makes them unlikely to be protectors of it. It would be like seeking out the inquisitors to protect the heretics. It's an unlikely combination. And I think we witnessed that. And so I think we often increasingly see that if we want constitutional liberty protected, we have to restore the balance of power to ordinary people in as many cases and places as possible and take it away from power abusing, power seeking elites who will inevitably and inescapably corrupt their institutions against our constitutional liberty.
Yeah, that makes sense. I didn't know that. So that's why we have summer, because summer is the time for harvesting. Oh, okay, for school. Okay, that makes sense now. I didn't know that about, see, I didn't learn that. I did learn about the Constitution when I was a kid, and I've used it when I was a kid to get things I wanted, like goofy things, because I was a kid. But I think that that's really important to do that. I like your idea. Um, with regard to the people that have been in power, let's say in the last 10, 20 years, in terms of presidents or senators, congressmen, House of Representatives and stuff, what kind of things have you seen that people um, are doing that is abhorrent to the Constitution and Bill of Rights?
Well, really, there's sort of four pathways that I think have been particularly critical in the modern age. And I, loosely describe them it's the same as it's at 1776 Law Center: food freedom, financial freedom, medical freedom, political freedom. And political freedom involves all those core Bill of Rights that we think about: the right to petition your government for redress of grievances, which includes the right to access courts and the right to open courts and transparent courts, but also the right of speech and association and expression and affiliation of whether it's religion, politics, or press. And then you have the Second Amendment that's part of that. You have other aspects: your right to self-defense, your right to bodily autonomy under the Fourth Amendment. And that finds expression in medical freedom, which ever since the pandemic has become a peak issue for a lot of people's public consciousness. Before then, they weren't paying as much attention to what was happening in the big pharmaceutical industry and the big medicine industry. The takeover of the medical practice over a century that started with the Rockefellers. And you can look back at what the Rockefellers' agenda was. It's kind of like Bill Gates's agenda today. It's a lot more dystopian than utopian if you care about fundamental liberties. And to the point that, if we don't own our own bodies, then what do we own? And if they can force us to take a experimental drug to do the things that the Nuremberg Code was supposed to forever prohibit, for us being involuntary subjects of medical experimentation, which is really what the vaccine mandate really was. A lot of COVID policy, you could argue, was about that. And whether you liked or disliked the idea of it, we shouldn't be forcing anyone to be subject to such medical experimentation. And then you talk about financial freedom and food freedom. That, as technology has emerged and things like crypto coins and Bitcoin and this alternative way of transacting and storing value and exchanging with your neighbors and others outside of the control of big central banks and big governments with their centralized planners and currency controls, then that provided a kind of an exit ramp from the control grid of the Bill Gateses of the world. And then one of the most fundamental that I've often been involved in recently has been food freedom, which is, if we can't control what goes into our own bodies, then we don't own our own bodies. And if we don't own our own bodies, well, there's a legal definition for that. We're chattel. We're chattel of somebody, just not ourselves. And we've seen over the past half century, I mean, we went from being one of the greatest food producers in the world in America, where 90 to 95% of the food we ate at the time of our founding we got from ourselves. We farmed it ourselves or from our local farmer. We knew, and they were doing it in organic, natural methods. There weren't a bunch of chemicals and additives and preservatives and pesticides. There was no corporatized, mechanized, and industrialized food supply.
You could be a rapper.
Well, and that's what we have today. I mean, it is like a bad rap, in terms of what's taking place. Our corporate, we now have that corporatized, mechanized, industrialized food supply is now monopolized food supply. 98% of the food that we see anywhere available on our kitchen tables come from 3 or 4 corporations. They control almost all the pigs, almost all the chicken, almost all the beef, almost all of everything. And that has not been good for our public health. And then they've done all the additives and preservatives and processed food and ultra processed food and high processed food. And they got all kinds of crazy things in food we were never supposed to eat. And we've seen it. I mean, with the food pyramid is basically here is what you should never eat, and
Yeah.
yet that's what they tell us to eat.
Right.
And
It's crazy.
and the old school, original, organic, natural farmers. I mean, like there's one community that if you wanted to say, what would the world look like if we look like our founding fathers, if we practiced the way our founding fathers' generation did, the people who fought for and birthed freedom around the world, not just in America. Well, there is a group in America that is outside of the control of big tech, isn't on, social media, isn't on, isn't addicted to the new TikTok video app. It doesn't get their news from Google. There is one group that's outside of big pharma, generally doesn't take a lot of medicines, generally doesn't rely or depend upon that world. That's outside of the control of big food. They mostly grow their own food, eat their own food, all in natural, organic ways, avoiding pesticides, avoiding chemicals, avoiding additives, avoiding preservatives in the way they produce that food. And that group is the Amish.
Yes.
And so for the last 5-10 years, some of the Amish have been making their lifestyle or part of the benefits of their lifestyle accessible to everybody else. Said, how would you like to have the milk that we drink? How would you like to have the cheese and the yogurt and the butter made in the same natural way multiple generations of Amish, but also multiple generations of Americans did? Natural. Like they like to call something raw milk or raw butter. Better way is call it natural milk, natural butter. Doesn't have a lot of chemicals in it, doesn't have a lot of additives in it, hasn't been burned out of all of its bacteria through pasteurization that got rid of all the good bacteria you need for your body to survive.
Exactly.
And yet these people are under attack, even though they provide less than all of farmers, direct farm to table, despite all the so-called direct farm to table revolution in the country, only 2% of our food comes directly from farm to table. And they're trying to crush even that little 2%. Because people that get the food from, say, an Amish farmer discover their lives end up being much better, much healthier, much happier. If they live if we look at the Amish are living happier, healthier, longer lives than the rest of us than ever before.
Right.
Maybe that's because they're not inside the Bill Gates control grid, and they're outside of that Tron system, outside of that matrix. And what you find there are happy, healthy people living longer lives. And that's why the system is trying to crush them.
Mm. So regarding, I love the Amish. I love that guy that got his farm kind of shut down for a while, and I think he won, right? Amos.
Yes, the most prominent Amish farmer providing an exit ramp from the control grid for people for the last 10 years has been a fifth generation Lancaster County, Pennsylvania dairy farmer by the name of Amos Miller. You can go to AmosMillerOrganicFarm.com and you can see all the incredible products that he has available. And he has served over millions of food products over 20 years to tens of thousands of Americans. And by the admission of the government on the stand in a case concerning him, every single government official had to admit, under penalty of perjury, that not one person that has ever consumed any product of Amos Miller's has ever complained to anybody about anything related to it. Not about its safety, not about its accuracy, not about its honesty, not about its quality. And that's because he produces some of the highest quality food anywhere and has one of the best safety track records, especially for food, of anybody anywhere. And yet, he has been the number one target of the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, the number one target of the U.S. Department of Agriculture to be shut down and suppressed. They have multiple times tried to jail him, tried to take his farm, tried to foreclose on his farm, tried to get a big monetary judgment against him, seized his food, ordered the destruction of his food, tried to prohibit and prevent him selling his food, tried to prohibit him from even making his own farmed food available to his own family, demanding he ration it according to their demands. They even limited him what he could feed his own pigs. That's how insane they have been. because they want a power grab where they control all food from farm to table. They want to be able to go into all of our kitchens, walk into our refrigerator, and say, here's what you can eat and here's what you can't. And if you get a little glimpse of these people, they're exactly what you imagined them to be. They're that horrible person you interacted with at the DMV, except they control our food supply. They're low IQ lord asses of an extraordinary scale. And yet they're trying to dictate our food policies, what goes into our bodies, when these people are clearly not doing a very good job of what's going into theirs.
Right.
And that's what the Amos Miller case is just the touchstone of.
Wow. Well, I'm sending Amos and the Amish my prayers. That sounds crazy. So with regard to that though, with their trying to take away our organic natural food supply, that goes against our Fourth Amendment. Is that what you're saying?
It goes against all of our constitutional rights. That then this is and we have you couldn't have a better source for that than Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said, if they can control our food, then it will be as damaging to our souls as the worst tyranny we've ever faced. Because that, in fact, Henry Kissinger once said, if you control food, you control entire countries.
Right.
And that's what this is about. If Bill Gates, I mean, people should ask themselves, why is Bill Gates, who opposes natural farming, opposes organic farming, calls it a threat to the environment, why is he the number one buyer of farmland across the United States for the last 10 years?
Right.
Why is this guy that doesn't like farms doing so? Why is he a big promoter of big chemical companies, big pesticide companies, big fake, we should call it fake meat. He calls it beyond meat. It means fake meat, fake food products. He wants us eating, he wants us eating the bugs.
Right.
He's not going to be eating the bugs, but he wants us eating the bugs. And the ultimate counter to that, the sort of Morpheus of our modern matrix, is the Amos Millers of the world, who didn't set out to change the world. He just made food the way his father did it, the way his grandfather did it, the way his great-grandfather did it, and his great-grandfather before him. And that was natural, organic. If you're out there on the farm, you think you're in the mountains of Switzerland or the fields of France. I mean, it's just beautiful and gorgeous, and you feel the natural, lush nature expressing itself. And if you drink his milk, I mean, people joked that when I was drinking it, they thought I was doing cocaine. I said it's as good, it's as good as cocaine, and apparently the government wants to call it as bad as cocaine, worse than cocaine, according to the government. Amos Miller's milk, it's that good. But that's what we're facing today is their attempt to completely monopolize our food supply and shut down every small independent farmer that's a challenge to that corporate monopoly on our food supply.
Thank you. With regard to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, what was the effect of lockdowns and shutting down people's businesses?
I think it woke up a lot of people that, quite frankly, it's the method. They've always used emergencies to gut our rights. And I used to call these three cases in America the trilogy of infamy. And one of them, two of the three, a lot of people knew about. Korematsu was the case where the U.S. Supreme Court said it was okay for the U.S. government to take away people's businesses, take away people's churches, take away people's schools, take away people's property, take away people from being able to even be with their own family, and lock them up in detention camps if their great-grandfather was from Japan. That case relied upon another case called Buck v. Bell. That was a case in which the Supreme Court proudly enforced forced sterilization of young girls against their informed consent. In fact, it was the favorite case of one Adolf Hitler throughout his time as Nazi Germany. What a lot of people don't know is those two horrendous cases, Korematsu and Buck, all based their logic on a case called Jacobson. And Jacobson was a case about requiring vaccination as a condition of having access to an entire community, forced vaccinations. And as soon as the pandemic came around, they were citing Jacobson right away. as
Was in the 1800s, though, wasn't he?
yeah, the decision itself came out in 1905, 1906. It actually didn't stand for anything near as far as they wanted to take it, but it was the foundation of a horrendous line of cases, Jay, because what they basically said is in an emergency, you can do what you want if you're the government, and you can kind of suspend constitutional liberty.
So is that the
And
pandemic exception? What is the pandemic exception that Trump signed like 3 months before we heard of COVID? What
what
was that?
it basically does is it allows them to short circuit all of representative government and the democratize the method of government. So you have all these special immunities that you declare something an emergency, and all of a sudden a bunch of big corporations have immunity if they cause you harm, as long as they're doing something that's supposed to help solve the emergency. That's called the PrEP Act, which is why that people can't sue vaccine makers and can't sue other people that caused harm, even if they did so knowingly and deliberately and corruptly. The So that's part of it. But the other part is our courts, sadly, tend to go to sleep whenever they see, oh, emergency. Oh, we better not apply the Constitution anymore. We got a world war. Oh, let's not apply the Constitution. Oh, we got a pandemic. Oh, let's not apply the Constitution. And people saw it overnight. All of a sudden, all of us were forced into house arrest without being charged with a crime or convicted by a jury. We were all of every right we thought we had: the right to go to church, the right to go to school, the right of our occupation, the right to pursue our vocation, the right to see our family at significant events, whether it was funerals or weddings, the right to be with our family at critical events, such as when they're in the hospital near the end of life, or to be there when a child is born. All of it taken away overnight by power mad politicians in the name of a pandemic. And so it woke a lot of people up that our Constitution is in a risky position currently because the people who are supposed to enforce it are not.
And with that thing that you were saying where the Supreme Court ruled about the Japanese and stuff, or Jacobson, does that supersede the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? No.
It can't. But what it is it's judges just not doing their job. For example, a lot of people found out who really mattered in your local town was your sheriff, because in some places the sheriff had a conscience. The sheriff knew I took an oath not to uphold the governor's rules, not to uphold local politicians' rules, not to uphold Anthony Fauci's rules. I took the Constitution with my oath to the Constitution of the United States. And so they refused to enforce a lot of these pandemic provisions that were clearly lawless. But what it showed to us is we have a lot of people in power whose sole and whole job is to protect the Constitution, that will eviscerate it at a moment's notice if they find any excuse or pretext to do it. And their favorite one is emergency.
So I tried to find my sheriff, but I don't have a sheriff where I live. Los Angeles has a sheriff. I live in Los Angeles, but I'm in Laurel Canyon and we don't have a sheriff. Because I was like, okay, I want to find out about this. I want to find out what I can do. And I didn't have any. The other sheriff laughed at me. The one that's near me in West Hollywood, they made fun of me when I called, seeing if they could be my sheriff and stop stuff. And they said, oh, that's not happening. But it was. So, with regard to the regenerative farms, that's one thing that Robert Kennedy Jr. wants, is to do regenerative farming, organic regenerative farming. And he wants to help the people, because there are a lot of farmers who are kind of enslaved by the GMO and the pesticides, because you can't, nature is no longer available to you. You cannot, you have to buy your seeds, and and that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars apparently. And then you have to spray, which kills everything else and hurts your health and your pets and your family and your friends and the neighborhood trees. So I really like the idea of increasing Amos Miller's way of doing things all over the country. I think that would be a really good thing. And I do think it would help with clearing out some of the emissions that we have, because a lot of our emissions come from the processed food company, come from a lot of the toxins that kill the ocean, come from conventional farming, and a lot of the toxins that kill the microbiome in the soil come from conventional farming. And so I really like that he wants to do that. And does that go with what you think about like what would be good?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, Robert Kennedy, Congressman Thomas Massey, both have really been on top of this related to food freedom. And Robert Kennedy's been on top of it regarding political freedom, freedom from censorship, medical freedom in terms of bodily autonomy in the case of medicine, and financial freedom in the case of Bitcoin. Robert Kennedy really gets it at many levels. And the reason why he's campaigning as an independent candidate for president is because he's one of the few people who gets it. He understands the threat that the dystopian world of the Bill Gates elites want, and how that threatens and endangers every single one of our liberties. And we need counteract. We need a exit ramp from that control grid. And part of that is alternative health. Part of that is old, natural, organic food from regenerative farming done the traditional way. Part of that is methods and mechanisms of communication outside the big tech monopoly and state colluded censorship, and financial freedom, being able to have other means of exchange, of storing value and exchanging amongst ourselves without being limited to central banks' printed pieces of paper. And so absolutely, it's all part of it. I mean, like Amos Miller just wants to farm. He loves to farm the way every generation of Amish farmer has farmed. He loves it when people get his products and they find healing powers in those products that they can't find anywhere else. Many people testified under penalty of perjury how essential his food products were either to their health or their child's health, because we've completely forgotten how to do things organically and naturally. That all of a sudden we get access to it, and it has extraordinary restorative power, not just to our bodies, but to our souls.
Exactly.
And that's what Amos Miller represents. And the legal fight to defend him is to make sure we have more Amos Millers, not fewer.
Yes, 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 yes. Is there so like with let's say Trump and Biden, where they both shut down the country, that was violating our Constitution, and where was it violating? What did it violate?
The worst violations took place at the most local level of government, sadly. It was so I sued a bunch of people. I sued mayors, I sued county governments, I sued some cases sheriffs, I sued governors. They were the worst, most egregious abusers. What you had was Fauci advising somebody to do something, but Trump himself never actually signed any order requiring it. And so instead, Fauci circumvented that. Deborah Birx brags about this in her book, by getting local governments to do it instead. And they were eager. I don't think anyone will ever look at your local public health authority the same. They
Oh,
thought of your local public health authority as this emergency rescuer in time of need. No, they're complete control freaks who will use any opportunity to take over your lives. And
right.
that's what they did. And they were usually the instigator, getting governors and mayors to go along with them. I had to sue in my own hometown, where I'm originally from, Chattanooga, Tennessee, because the mayor shut down an Easter egg roll outside of a church. An Easter egg roll. It was outdoors. I was like, when did we forget that pandemics don't really spread outdoors like they do indoors? How did we
Right.
forget everything about pandemics for over a century?
Yeah,
Yet,
people.
because they were power mad. We had a virus, all right. It was a virus of power greedy politicians.
Yeah, in California, Newsom went nuts. We couldn't go. They took down basketball hoops in areas where kids would play. They wouldn't let us go on the beach. They wouldn't let us
Well, I
buy.
mean, they blocked skateboarding. One
Right,
of the great Southern California old school young kid traditions. You couldn't go outdoors and skateboard. You had
right,
to stay indoors, be frustrated, where you would be more likely to both get the virus and spread it.
right. Because when you're stressed, your body does not have a good immune system. So you're saying that Trump and Biden, when they said we are going to, because Trump says he locked down the country. He has videos saying, I locked it down. We did the right thing. I locked it down. We had to lock it down. We shut it down. He has all these videos. So you're saying he didn't do that?
Legally, he did not. Legally, there was no order from Trump. He never signed off on it. And then he gave contradictory explanations later. When he wanted to take credit for anything good that came about from it, or perceived good, then he said he ordered the lockdown. When he recognized that there was more blowback than upside, then he acknowledged that legally he never did and quite frankly couldn't,
So he,
because a lot of those issues are still controlled in America at the state level. So it was all the governors and mayors who are really behind the big lockdowns. Trump made a lot of dumb statements early on during the pandemic that encouraged them to do that, criticized Sweden and other things. And it was one of the reasons why Robert Kennedy is running, is he doesn't have confidence that Trump would stand up to that if it came around again. But legally, he never could and never did.
so he
The
basically knew how to cover his ass, it sounds like.
Yeah, completely, completely. And really, what it was is, but it was orchestrated by Fauci, I think, and organized by Bill Gates. I think if they hadn't used their institutional influence to push it, then I don't think a lot of mayors and governors would have had the brazen attitude to do it on their own at the scale it took place.
Right.
Now, in places like California and New York, it would have happened anyway, because those governors were power mad. Cuomo was all excited about grabbing power, especially Newsom. I mean, like, if you look at around the world, if you find, like, say, China and Cuba and Venezuela, some communist countries or countries that are aligned that way, particularly Cuba and China, they loved the shutdowns because it was their excuse to say, see, we're so great as a government. Because we're totalitarian, we can prevent you from even getting disease. Now, it didn't turn out that way, of course. Instead, all they did was sabotage their economies in ways they may never recover from, including even in China. But it gives you, like, wherever the government was the most totalitarian, that's where you got the most oppressive pandemic regimes. And what's interesting is there was a lot of Western democracies that were doing it, whereas a lot of African countries did not. A lot of and places like Russia let up very early. So-called totalitarian Russia didn't mandate vaccines.
Interesting.
So-called totalitarian Russia opened up a lot sooner than we did in America. So it maybe gives you a little glimpse that countries that are called totalitarian might not be the real totalitarians after all.
Yeah, that seems to be there's a lot of propaganda. With regard to the press, is that's part of the Constitution or no? Because I think I read in the Bill of Rights that the press is kind of important uh, for our.
Oh, absolutely. The freedom of press, the right to report, the right to explain, the right to investigate, all of that is protected. I mean, basically, the five core rights in the First Amendment involve religion, involve speech, involve the press, involve the right to petition, and then certain rights of expression, affiliation, and association correspondent there too. Within the First Amendment, really are certain rights that go beyond what people recognize them. But without question, one of those core rights is the right of a free, independent press.
But it doesn't seem like the press is free or independent now. There's something
It's
more.
just like the regulatory agencies. Corporate collusion, corporatization, monopolization and then our cultural institutions has created this sort of elite professional managerial class that's credentialed and licensed, and they love all their licensure authorities and credentialing control. And people I've been a critic of it for a long time. People finally got to see that in real time when honest, conscientious doctors come out and say, hold on, this is bad medical advice. Maybe it's about, well, whether ivermectin is good or bad, whether a vaccine is good or bad, whether locking little kids up and not letting them go to school is good or bad. What happened? All of a sudden, all these medical boards try to take away their credentials, try to take away their licenses. And journalism is the same. A journalist used to be some local person from the neighborhood. Now it's some kid from Colombia. These are people that don't understand the world. They have an elite mindset, and what they do is they're just stenographers for these corrupt institutions of influence. They're not real reporters.
Is there a way to get, like, we have, like, it's captured, so the news is generally captured, maybe not everybody, but for the most part, most news things, you can see the bias, you can see the lies. I mean, I have a really good radar for that. I grew up with people who were kind of not in my family, but in areas where people were doing really nefarious things to kids, and I saw it, and I think it helped me have a sense of when somebody's lying, because they were lying. they're still being sued, and I'm all grown up and I'm not suing them, but other people are still suing these people because they were pedophiles. And anyway, that's not the subject. But so, but so with regard to the whole, like the First Amendment, why aren't people in the, or can we get, can there be a rule or a law in that's part of the Constitution, or, is, with the Constitution support, are news stations not being funded by people with agendas, like by big ag, or by military industrial complex, or by pharma, or by whoever else, NRA, whoever, right? Anybody, like any
Well,
corporation.
yeah, I mean, arguably that's what it was originally there for, and that it wasn't just to protect the right of the press to investigate and report, but hope to promote an independent and free press. And that would not be within the control of a foreign government or the control of a limited group of corporate donors or advertisers, which is what we currently have. So it's like one of the reasons they hated Alex Jones was that Alex Jones, aside from the fact that he was the biggest person on the political right who was anti-war and against the surveillance state and things like that, and was one of the biggest early critics of pandemic politics, was that he showed an independent way to operate a press. Like, how does somebody who has an opinion that the Bill Gateses of the world despise, how does he have a big audience? Well, it's because he built an audience based on a direct market audience. In other words, they would buy products that he likes and uses, and thus he would circumvent any dependence on corporate advertisers or corporate donors. So what terrified them about Alex Jones wasn't just his own opinions. It was other people could use this. Other people could figure out, I can build an independent audience without being, I can restore the way Amos Miller is restoring natural food. I could restore a free press. And that's why they went after him with lawfare and weaponized legal system, and then massive social media censorship, and then a libel campaign against him disguised as a libel lawsuit. The goal was, hey, anybody, if you're thinking about replicating this method, we're going to do everything possible to prohibit and prevent you from doing so. Was one of the reasons why I took on aspects of his legal representation over time, was to try to stop them from crushing him in such a way that it would discourage or deter others from restoring our right of a free press. There's no question that we need a free press. The Constitution calls for a free press, but that we currently don't have one due to who is dominating the staffing of those organizations and who controls advertising. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Big Pharma gets such favorable treatment from the institutional press when they are the number one advertiser of news institutions in America.
Yeah, not a mystery. uh, this is so tricky, and doesn't seem like, in terms of the news, that it doesn't seem like news owners want a free press. I think they must get something that I don't know, that inspires them to say, no, we're not going to talk about this subject. We're not going to talk about this subject. We're not going to talk about this subject. With the pandemic, when Biden said mandates, was that a Biden breaking our Fourth Amendment, or was that again with the local governments or local companies?
In that case, Biden violated the Constitution directly, because he was trying to use all the powers of the executive branch to force vaccines onto people. And even though he had reason to know at the time that the vaccines were not even vaccines, they didn't inoculate against anything. They didn't prevent the transmission or infection of COVID-19. And because, for example, I represent Brooke Jackson, who brought the biggest False Claims Act claim against Pfizer for its lies and ripping the American people off of billions of dollars related to the COVID vaccine. And the Trump contract with Pfizer required that what they deliver would be safe, effective vaccine for the prevention of COVID-19. What they actually delivered, as she was able to document very early on before it was ever mandated on anyone, to the Justice Department, but the Justice Department forced her and kept it hidden from the world for over a year, was that it was not safe, was not effective, it's not a vaccine, didn't prevent COVID-19. In fact, it was very dangerous, was leading to disabilities and deaths at a frightening level. And there was data from the Pfizer studies that they were hiding that proved that. But the government knew it all the way then, and yet the Biden administration tried to force it on the whole world. And in fact, in a week or so, I'll be down in Beaumont, Texas, on May 1st, defending Brooke Jackson, because the Biden administration is demanding that her case be completely dismissed, no discovery be allowed, no hearing be allowed, no trial be allowed, because it would be embarrassing to the Biden administration for the world to find out how bad that drug was. So,
When
yeah,
did you find that
Biden, what Biden did wasn't just against the law, it was flat out criminal.
what she did, when she did her thing, wasn't that still in Trump's reign? So
Yeah, so it
Trump put
started at the end of Trump and continued on through the Biden administration.
so I think she also showed that they were unblinding people, that the doctors weren't always blinded themselves about who was vaccinated and who wasn't, and that they were just throwing needles into a hefty bag or something, right? Is that right? Because I read it a long time ago.
I mean, she'd been involved for decades in the clinical trial context. So she wasn't some anti-vaxxer like the Pfizer tried to pretend. And what she walked into was the biggest debacle of a clinical drug test she'd ever witnessed or could imagine. I mean, literally, needles are sticking out of bags. People's private medical information is plastered on walls. People are on gurneys out in the middle of the hallway, not being monitored. People are experiencing adverse events and they're not reporting it or recording it. They're not blinding anything. They're not even doing temperature control tests, which were critical to make sure that the vaccine was properly injected in the first place. They were
Right.
giving people money under the table.
The vaccines were temperature controlled, right? And they weren't
Yes.
testing that?
They weren't testing that. They weren't, I mean, everything that you go into a clinical testing to do to make sure you have accurate numbers to know whether it would be safe and effective, they violated pretty much all of them. There were like 81 different violations that she was able to document. And all she did is ask them to slow down, fix it before they go forward. And instead, as soon as they realized she was going to blow the whistle on them, they fired her. And after she talks to the FDA in the morning, in the afternoon, Pfizer's lawyers calling her personal phone number that only the FDA knew.
Right.
So you have this corrupt, and now the lawyer who was at the FDA helping to cover up the Pfizer's criminality is now the Biden Justice Department official assigned to Brooke Jackson's case. Then that's the degree of corruption here is extraordinary. You have the biggest public health scandal in the history of the United States. You have one of the biggest frauds. You're talking about billions and billions of dollars stolen from American taxpayers in the history of the United States.
Yeah.
You have Pfizer, the biggest criminally sanctioned drug dealer in the history of the world by our own government and other governments over time. And they're going to get away with it because the Biden administration is demanding the judge dismiss it because they don't want to be embarrassed come election day that they forced a dangerous, ineffective, non-vaccine drug on the population.
I really admire Brooke Adams for speaking up, because I saw that she took lots of pictures. I saw all the stuff she did, and she really put herself at risk, I thought, to do that. And it seems like she's still doing that. Not because of what she did was dangerous in a real way, but because there's a lot of corruption going on.
Correct.
That person.
Yeah, and people can find all about it or a case. IamBrookeJackson.com. Also, we have stuff up at 1776lawcenter.com. She's an extraordinary whistleblower, one of the bravest whistleblowers. She forfeited her entire career. She knew the moment she came forward that she was never going to be able to work in the pharmaceutical clinical trial world ever again. So forfeited a very promising and economically productive career. I mean, all of a sudden her mail was being opened up after this happened before it got to her, including things that related to the court's case against Pfizer. All kinds of weird things started happening to her. So she knew that she was at personal risk and exposure because she was exposing the biggest public health scandal in American history. And what's unique about it is it's not just the biggest corporate drug dealer in the history, criminal drug dealer in the history of the world. It's the Biden administration. It's the current president of the United States, the current Justice Department, the current Food and Drug Administration. They're all complicit. They're all involved. And yet she was willing to step forward, stay strong, and go forward. She's an example like Amos Miller is for farming, Brooke Jackson is for whistleblowing against big pharma, that's how we change the world. Even if we face a lot of obstacles in the interim, their conscientiousness is how the world changes. And so credit to her for willing to stand up for all of us in the process.
The person you said who is the ruling judge was appointed by the Biden Association.
No, the Justice Department prosecutor. So the lawyer for the government that's appearing in the case was at the FDA when all this illegality was happening as a lawyer for the FDA. So she could be personally implicated if the case went forward. What they don't want the world to know is, what did the Biden administration know about the illegalities that Pfizer was doing? Was the Biden administration in on the fraud? Because they demanded every soldier take this drug. If they knew all along, oh, it's really not effective. Oh, it's not even really safe. Oh, it's not even a vaccine. Then that is as damning as it gets. That means it would be the biggest Nuremberg violation since the Nazis. And the Biden administration is the one doing it.
And with that breach and like of the Constitution and the Nuremberg trial, is the Nuremberg code, is that valid in America? Can cases be put on with that as well?
It should be. And in the past, it was America who created the Nuremberg Code. And America said there's a certain code that is so universal, it's legally enforceable against the entire world. Even if you live in a country that didn't adopt it, and even if you were doing what the government told you to do, you can still be held accountable if you violate this universal code. So much so that we ordered people's execution for violating it. And yet, today in America, federal courts are threatening lawyers who bring Nuremberg Code suits. I know this because I've been one of the lawyers threatened by federal judges for even talking about the Nuremberg Code. A judge in Fayetteville, Arkansas, probably not coincidentally the home of Tyson Foods, who I was suing, threatened all the lawyers who brought a Nuremberg Code claim with sanctions for even talking about it. And that shows you how far our courts have drifted from our constitutional principles. That now the same American courts that created the Nuremberg Code to enforce on the whole world are saying the one place you can't enforce them is in American courts by Americans, for Americans, against others.
Wow. And isn't Tyson owned by China now?
Tyson has a lot of interesting ties. So it still is it's almost all controlled and run still by the Tyson family, which is very tight with the Biden administration, was very tight with the Clintons before them. And like this federal district court judge has ties to Tyson Foods, yet didn't recuse himself from a case concerning Tyson Foods. It's showing where our judicial branch, our legislative branch, our executive branch at different levels since the pandemic has broken down because they're more worried about protecting the institutions or grabbing power than they are enforcing the Constitution or protecting our rights.
The guy who works at the FDA and then now is the justice guy, did he work for pharma before, or what is his background?
In this particular case, it's a she.
Oh,
and yes, she spent her entire life working for big pharma in one way, shape, or form.
And then
And
she
she
worked,
just now has the Justice Department mantle to hide behind.
and
So
she used to work at the FDA.
yeah, she worked for big corporate firms representing big pharmaceutical industry, then goes to work for the FDA, where she's supposed to be regulating the pharmaceutical industry, but instead is protecting the pharmaceutical industry, then gets to work at the Biden administration, where she's supposed to be investigating and prosecuting the pharmaceutical industry, and yet again is still acting like a defense lawyer for the pharmaceutical industry. It shows you how much our system of government has been captured by the institutions they're supposed to be regulating.
Right. This is what Bobby Kennedy talks about in terms of corruption and how he wants to stop that. Because it seems endemic. I mean, what the USDA says is good food, like you mentioned, is don't eat it, you know? And what the EPA says is safe apparently causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, glyphosate. Um, and Monsanto had to pay, I think, 11 billion. Bobby fought them, had to pay 11 billion to, I think, 40,000 different people who got non-Hodgkin's by using Roundup, which is where glyphosate is found. You know, so like there's so many places where, you know, the FEC, if that's the right three-letter word, I think is funded by a lot of phone companies. So then they have their propaganda. They have their propaganda that they're saying in the FEC, if that, or maybe it's the FCC, right?
Oh,
FCC.
yes, correct. Federal Communications Commission.
Right, FCC, yes. The FCC then is bought by them. So I learned about this thing because I'm doing I'm trying to do some environmental work to restore the kelp in California. We've lost 96% of our kelp. And kelp is important, you know, it sequesters heavy metals, it sequesters carbon, it does a lot of good things, and it reconstitutes the ecosystem. Then one of the people who's helping me do it, I'm working with a bunch of scientists, but I also met this person who's a diplomat who has done this kind of work. He said, you have to go to ALEC. And I said, what is ALEC? And he said, ALEC, ALEC, it's, I forget what it stands for, but it's a group of lobbyists that work with legislators to write our bills, and the lobbyists who are supporting the companies write the bill, and then the legislative person has to get the bill voted on. Is that accurate? Like, that's kind of what I was reading about it. When he said it, I was like, what is that? And he kind of gave me an explanation. He's a human rights lawyer, but which is also environmental, but
Increasingly, it's so. I mean, there's been a degree to which it's always been true. It's one of my criticisms of representative government, is that the probability that my view fundamentally is this: you give a small group of people power, they will misuse and abuse that power. So that you can try to tell them they have to do it in a certain way. You can beg them to try to do it in a certain way. You can make them take oaths that they'll do it in a certain way. The reality is, you give a small group of people power, they'll abuse that power.
so what's
And
this? Go ahead. Go
and in
ahead.
the context of like representation, that commonly happens. I mean, we're spending billions of dollars to all kinds of foreign countries at the moment to get involved in all kinds of wars. Most Americans oppose it, and yet it keeps happening over and over and over again. It keeps happening by people who run and campaign, like Speaker Mike Johnson did, saying he wouldn't do it. And then as soon as he gets into power, he does do it. The one thing he got elected to do, he does the opposite of, because there's no real controls on them. Like, if you're a congressman and you serve the interest of big pharma, big food, and the military industrial complex, you're set up for life. They'll get you think tank jobs. They'll get you book publishing deals. You'll get on the media, and they'll promote you as an expert and all of that jazz. So you can write your own check. You're getting not only guaranteed campaign funding for forever, and media protection for forever, and intelligence communities cover-ups for forever, but you're guaranteed a paycheck and status for forever. Whereas if you're independent, I mean, just look at what happens to members of Congress who stand up to big food, stand up to big pharma, stand up to the military industrial complex. They often face all kinds of opposition out of the blue. They often have underfunded campaigns. They often have media hostility and run into smear campaigns by the intelligence community. And they often face all kinds of lawfare. And if they ever lose office, they can't get any kind of job. You never hear from them again. They don't get any media access. I mean, the media won't even put people like Noam Chomsky on to discuss his, well-respected views about global politics around the world. Whether you agree or disagree with his particular positions on his particular issue, is a very well-respected scholar. Can't even get access to the American press. So it shows that the system, if you're elected to office, if you serve the people who can write you checks for forever, you're better off than if you serve the people who sent you there.
So it
And
becomes
that's the
selfish.
problem with the system.
It becomes a selfish thing instead of being an act of service.
Absolutely.
Because when
And
you're
and
talking about
and there's a
food,
disconnect. Well, that's why we shouldn't even have Washington D.C. Force congressmen to stay home. Now, don't get together in some little elite town where they go to the French restaurants and the steak houses and all the rest. Then they go on these lobbyist jaunts. They take them to golf trips and exotic vacations disguised as, I'm doing an investigation. I don't know why they always have to do an investigation in Paris or do an investigation in Venice or do an investigation in the Caribbean. All right. They're not investigating the hills of Afghanistan. It's that's why I want more power back to people. I think we have to have an institutional reform because our representative government is not really representative right now.
right? It seems like they're really representing corporate corruption and themselves for the most part. I think there are some good people. Um, I do think that there are some good
Oh
people.
yeah, you'll know because they're the ones getting attacked every day in the press. They're the
Right.
ones subject to leak campaigns. They're the ones who all of a sudden you see tons of advertising telling you they're terrible. That's the sign that that person must be legit.
Oh, interesting. So, what do you think could be the actual solution when you said we don't need a government? That seems kind of extreme, but what do you think is a solution to help this become less or uncorrupt, uncorruptible?
At every level that we can, as much power in the individual as possible, and then as much power at the local level as possible. The more accessible power is to the ordinary person, the more likely it's to be held in check and not get out of hand. And they're all kind of like sometimes that means in our legal system, for example, I'm for everything that we possibly can being decided in any dispute by a jury because judges have proven themselves untrustworthy defenders of the Constitution. Juries are not perfect, but I'll still trust them over judges who have proven incapable to protect our constitutional liberty with consistency. And in the context of politics, as much power as local as possible. The more we make power distant and inaccessible into a smaller group of people, the more likely it is to be abused. Robert Kennedy thinks we can purge and fix these agencies and place good people in them. And that's the conscientious tradition his father and his uncle had. My own view is I think at this point we've passed that. I don't trust these institutions to ever serve our interests as long as only a small group of people have a disparate amount of power. So I want as much power to ordinary people as we possibly can, whenever we can, however we can.
I mean, that is one thing that Bobby talks about is having, everybody having their own autonomy, being able to do what they want to do, as long as it doesn't, kill somebody else or, do something terrible, but generally be able to do what they want to do and, eat the food they want to eat, take the medicines they want to take, not take the medicines they don't want to take, do whatever it is, go where they want to go, have that freedom. He seems like he's really, really about freedom. I've known him 33 years and he's always been about freedom, for everybody, whether it's been freedom for the fishermen in the Hudson River or freedom for the indigenous Indians to have their land or freedom for the NAACP to be safe and, have goodness. And, like it's so much. He's always been about freedom in my experience.
Oh, absolutely, he is. And the only
Yeah,
question is, how do we get the most of it and the best of it? And
right.
he is the leader in proposing ideas for that. That's where his ideas of food freedom, financial freedom, medical freedom, political freedom, independent of thought, individual conscience as to bodily autonomy, he is showing what some of those pathways can be, what some of those exit ramps from the Gates dystopian grid of control can be. And I think as long as we pursue that path, that's a much more promising path than the one we're getting from the representatives, so called, in Washington.
Do you think that Bill Gates could be sued and win, even just for buying up our farmland or for polluting people or for,
I think Bill Gates is one of the biggest criminals in the world. And I think he makes Bond villains look like amateurs by comparison.
yeah,
So
I
I
was
think
talking to somebody
I
about
think
how he was
Anthony
perfect.
Fauci, I think George Soros, I think a bunch of these guys who've been trying to strip us of our rights and liberties, shut down farmers, take away our speech, lie to us, get politicians to lie to us and take away our liberties and freedoms. They are complicit in the greatest conspiracy against civil rights in the history of this country. And that has been a crime for more than a century and a half. And an honest legal system would criminally prosecute and punish them for what they've done.
So you listed Bill Gates, Fauci.
Anthony Fauci, I would Deborah Birx, but Fauci was really the lead on it. Some of a lot of Fauci's friends, including those who are helping to develop the virus in China.
Like Daypack and
The
Barrett.
Yes, and then people like George Soros, who has used his foundations against civil rights and civil liberties, rather than he says he's for civil rights and civil liberties, but he keeps undermining them everywhere. And he's even trying to do color revolutions, trying to create conflict. I mean, the war in Ukraine is a reflection of policies put in by George Soros, going all the way back to 1991. He's bragged about it in multiple contexts about the Maidan coup. So these are people that are constantly destabilizing our society and government around the world, and at some point should pay a consequence. And I believe there's enough evidence that many of them have engaged in criminal conduct that we really, but some of the, the biggest Nuremberg trials, that's what we really need, another set of Nuremberg trials, so this doesn't happen again, was judges. People forget that. If you watch the movie about the Nuremberg trials, it's judges on trial, and deservedly so, because judges who violate their constitutional oath, you could say if we were in Dante's hell, they would be at the very bottom because they are the traitors. They are the people who have betrayed their own oaths. They were the ones who are supposed to protect our constitutional liberty, and they were often the ones at the forefront of violating that constitutional liberty. So I think all the politicians and rogue power figures who are involved in the pandemic politics that has led to the deaths and disability and discrimination against millions of people around the world need to face Nuremberg trials for their deeds.
You said the Nuremberg trials were written over in America. And are you
Written by American judges and American jurists.
American jurists?
Yes. So what happened was American judges presided over that, and they wrote the Nuremberg Code. They wrote what became the Nuremberg Code. It was the indictment and the legal basis for the indictment. And then it was American judges were prosecutors in those cases. American judges were judges in the Nuremberg trial. But many of the people on trial were German judges who had violated the rights of ordinary people against their oath to the liberties of those people.
Right. Okay. And so those German judges, we should be using the same thing that got them whatever happened to them. The Hague.
We need a global set of Nuremberg trials, and for everybody around the world that is implicated. And it just happens to implicate some of the most powerful politicians, most powerful oligarchs, most powerful institutions in the world. But unless they're held to account, this will happen again.
That's fascinating. What am I not asking you that I should ask you?
I think we covered the landscape.
I think we did. You're amazing. You have such a good memory, and I really feel your passion. And I really feel your ethics, that you're looking out not just to protect Alex Jones, but to protect all independent newspapers, and not just to protect Brooke Adams or Amos Miller, but to protect the regenerative farmers or whistleblowers, right? So you're kind of doing stuff on a big scale for people who do things that go against this behemoth of government that is taking away our rights.
Yeah, the way I've often put it is, it's a guarantee I've represented someone that the people in the audience don't like, because many of my clients don't like one another. What they have in common is that they're fighting this behemoth of institutional power, that in all of my cases, they're the underdog, and that their case isn't really about them as much as it is about all of us. That what happens to them impacts all of us. So you might not like Robert Kennedy. You might not like Donald Trump. You might not like Alex Jones. You might not like the Covington kids. You might not like Ralph Nader. You might not like Wesley Snipes. But all of their cases concerned all of our rights and liberties. And that's why it's always important to look past the individual politics of the individual case and ask, what would be the impact of this case on my rights, on my liberties, on the things I care about? And if we filter it through that spectrum, which is what we do at the law firm and at 1776 Law Center, then we're best able and best positioned to protect everyone's freedom and liberty in the way our founding fathers intended.
I like that. I have one more question, but this is just regarding Trump. Recently, maybe it was in January or February, he said, look, the COVID vaccines also stop cancer.
It's the opposite. They're causing cancer.
Right. Shouldn't he also be, isn't that kind of criminal if he's seen? I mean, he should have seen, because he was out in 2021, right at the beginning of 2021, but he should have seen already, because even within the first couple of months, the vaccines were shown to be, didn't stop you from getting it, didn't stop you from giving it, and had many, many adverse reactions or deaths. So shouldn't he also, just like you were saying, Biden knew it, didn't Trump know it to some degree?
I think that, well, that's what's unclear. My pitch to President Trump has been, embrace the contract that you had Pfizer sign that required the delivery of a safe, effective vaccine for the prevention of COVID-19. Embrace Brooke Jackson's case. Because like the other little secret about Pfizer is they deliberately withheld the vaccine until after the election to help make sure Trump lost. The reason was Pfizer was concerned that Trump would never mandate the vaccine. They're also concerned that if Trump discovered they had lied to him, he would come after them for it in ways they knew Biden would not. And so that's the biggest difference between the two. The other factor is the Biden Justice Department, through the Brooke Jackson case, the Trump Justice Department actually hid the Brooke Jackson case from Trump. So Trump was never even told about the Brooke Jackson case while he was president of the United States. It was similar to, like, he told people to remove our troops from Syria, and he didn't find out until after he was out of office that they never did. They just laughed about it later. So my encouragement to President Trump has been to recognize that the issues with the vaccine by embracing his contract and embracing the Brooke Jackson case, because I want to transition him from someone who's defending the vaccines to someone who should be a critic of what the big drug companies did, since those people are not his allies anyway. As long as he doesn't, I think he limits his political success, and I think he subjects himself to legal risk and exposure over what's happened with the vaccines. But from what I've seen in the Brooke Jackson case, they deliberately hid the information about the dangers of the vaccine from President Trump.
Interesting. I'm trying to kind of grok how anybody in public office can't see that there's a ton of excess deaths, that there's a ton of new injuries, that young people, more excess deaths in young people than we've ever seen. I never heard of SADS until late 2021, maybe. That sudden adult death. I've heard of SIDS, and then that makes me question SIDS, if SIDS was from vaccines, because if SADS is from, I don't know if they are from vaccines, but it just seems like it should be really investigated.
There's no question about it. And the extraordinary thing about it is how powerful the administrative state and the bureaucracy and these corrupt actors have become, that even our elected president could be completely kept in the dark about things. The Robert Kennedy has talked about how they did this repeatedly to his uncle, President John Kennedy, and that when he would find something out, I think he had the right remedy. When he figured out the CIA was up to no good, they'd been lying to him year after year after year. He said, it's time to disperse the CIA to the winds. And I think that's the solution we need on all of these corrupt institutions. I mean, think about it. We're going through we're trying to figure out which three-letter agency is abusing our rights today. We know that's FBI, CIA, NSA, FTC, FCC, FEC. I mean, there's way too many of them.
They're
And
all
that
doing it. They're all doing it though. That's what seems so
completely. It's just different
it,
agency, different day, different name. If it's a three-letter agency, chances are they're violating your rights. That's
right.
three-letter agency means violating your rights.
Yikes. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you. I really appreciate that you go for the underdog because that is important because a lot of times, the big corporations want the person they can manipulate the best, and that's not cool. One more question regarding the whole pandemic thing or after effects. Do you agree that there was censorship? Do you think that that actually happened?
Oh, it happened at scale. I mean, the number one target was Robert Kennedy, but he was not the sole target. That
Right.
there was an effort to use big tech, monopoly over the digital public square, to effectively control the message. Like
But
that first
wasn't
case I talked about, the Pennsylvania courts trying to control the narrative by only allowing one official court reporter record the proceeding. That was just the government colluding with big tech to do it at scale for the entire world. Let's control the narrative. Only certain opinions are permissible. Other opinions must be shamed, must be censored, must be disowned, must be completely suppressed from public knowledge. When you have a lawyer as well respected as Robert Kennedy, from the most well respected political family, arguably alive today in the entire world, being subject to massive, coordinated, organized censorship, it probably tells you he's right, because otherwise, why engage in all the censorship?
well, when you're talking about, sorry, I still have more questions and I'm so sorry because I've taken you so long. When you're talking about the censorship, didn't the government, it's not censorship if Twitter does it. It's not censorship if Facebook does it. It's only censorship if government officials do it. And is
Within the meaning of the First Amendment, that is mostly true. There used to be a tradition, and the Supreme Court has not followed this tradition recently, but that if you were a monopoly, even a private monopoly, on the public square, you were subject to the same constitutional rights and responsibilities as anyone else. For example, in the old days, a company town would buy the entire town so that they could then prevent labor strikes. They could prevent petitioning. They could prevent protest. And the courts are like, hold on a second. That's going to eviscerate the First Amendment. So we're going to say that if you have a monopoly on the public square, you have taken on the obligation of the state concerning the First Amendment. And monopolies engaging in censorship of the public square should be equally constitutionally accountable. Our courts have not enforced that in a couple of decades, but that was the law and quite frankly still should be.
and that and you're saying Facebook, Twitter, TikTok,
These are in their space the legal definition of a monopoly. They
okay.
have more than 50% control of that part of the public square.
Okay. And then, but didn't Biden, because it said there was an appellate court judge that said that Biden did violate the First
Oh,
Amendment.
Biden went much further. Biden wasn't happy with them censoring. He demanded they censor, super censor. So as soon as he got in, he said, get rid of Bobby Kennedy. Get him off of Facebook. Get him off of Instagram. Don't allow Children's Health Defense to communicate to their own members on social media. Don't allow them to raise funds. He immediately recognized, and the Bill Gateses of the world immediately recognized, the greatest threat to their control grid was Robert Francis Kennedy Jr. And they used every tool they had. I mean, right now, they're not even giving him Secret Service, hoping he gets assassinated. I mean, this is the mindset of the Biden administration. I always call it's LBJ. If LBJ had a really dumb little brother, that would be Joe Biden. All the corruption, none of the intelligence.
Wow. So Okay, so there's that. What other things during the pandemic were violated in terms of, or during the whole, the whole pandemic lockdown, all that stuff? What other things when we're stuck in our houses? You said it was the whole Constitution, but when we're stuck in our houses, and also, didn't they just sign a new surveillance bill that surveils Americans?
A new extension of a version of the Patriot Act and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was supposed to supervise the intelligence agencies and instead had become a tool of the intelligence agencies. It's my reason for skepticism about giving small groups of people power. They always turn it on us. But and it's just the latest illustration. But if you did a law school exam on which constitutional rights were violated during the politics of the pandemic in 2020, it would be a yes box checked every single one. So it'd be right to freedom of the press, violated. Yes, right to freedom of association, violated. Right to freedom of religion. Weren't even allowed to go to church, even on Easter, some places, violated. Right to affiliation, association of the most personal kind. Being able to go see your loved one at a key time in a hospital, going to a funeral, going to a wedding, going to a graduation, any of those events, all those rights violated. The right to petition the government for redress of grievances, the right to have access to the courts, many courts completely shut down, violated. Your Second Amendment right of self-defense, whether you interpret that as a gun right or you interpret that as a right of bodily autonomy and integrity from intrusion and invasion by the state, both violated because they shut down your right to even get a permit to get a gun under the guise of, hey, it's pandemic, we don't have time to do that anymore. All of a sudden, if you needed to defend yourself because something was happening in your neighborhood or, an ex or something else, you couldn't get means to do so. Fourth Amendment rights, all the rights of bodily autonomy and privacy, routinely and regularly violated during the pandemic, particularly in the vaccine mandate, but not limited to that. Told you how to dress. We created a medical Sharia code. Said you got to put a mask on your face when you walk in this place or that place. I had clients who, for reasons of physical disability, could not wear that mask. And if they walked into a grocery store, they were run out of the grocery store by a mob screaming at them. Not doing the math of, okay, I'm wearing this mask so there's no breath going in between, so I'm going to go around and scream at someone that doesn't have the mask. That's the genius level of this.
Same
Fifth
with
Amendment rights to due process. Your property was taken without just compensation in violation of the Fifth Amendment. Your
which
Sixth
property,
Amendment rights to
which
counsel,
property,
you name it.
which property? You mean your health property, or you mean your business property, or both?
All of it. So, but take the business property. I mean, what was, I mean, you had businesses that had been established for over 130 years that were lost their business in less than 6 months in places like New York City. And wasn't that the taking of their business without just compensation? Businesses being forced to shut down, businesses being forced to not take customers, not take clients, not be restaurants being shut down, bars being shut down, all kinds of institutions being shut down. It was amazing which institutions were magically immune from the virus. If you were at Walmart, if you were a casino, if you were an alcohol provider, if you were one of these big stores, if you were Amazon, by golly, you were immune from the virus. But if you were a local mom and pop shop, if you were your local church, your local school, your local neighborhood association, your local pub, your local restaurant, by golly, the virus always magically infected those places and had to shut them down. But those businesses were taken away from people in violation of without compensation, in violation of their right to just compensation before anything is taken from them. And so that's why I say pretty much then you went to jury trial, they were excluding people who had questions about the pandemic. So you were getting prejudiced jury pools in many cases. So your right to trial by jury in civil and criminal cases was being deprived. So it was all a unique, extraordinary example of how you can violate every constitutional right in 30 days or less was the politics of the pandemic.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm so glad you're out there fighting for our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, and for Amos and for Brooke and for all the people out there who are, doing good in the world by speaking up, by doing their healthy stuff, whatever it is. I love that. I like the 1776 thing. That sounds very interesting and very generous. And I love your passion. I love your know-how. I feel like I got, a great personalized, you know, lecture from a genius professor. Thank you so very much. And again,
Thank you.
Robert Barnes, and your law firm is called.
Oh, Barnes Law LLP is in Peter.com.
Barnes Law LLP as in Peter.com. Thank you so much. I
Thank
really
you very much.
and you know what? I'm going to okay, and I appreciate everybody for listening. Thank you. And I hope you learned something. I sure did.